coffee grounds and bleach. That's what swallowed pride smells like when you're scraping it off the floor of a service station at 2 a.m. Most people think absolute power is loud. It isn't. Power is the quiet, heavy click of a gold lighter in a room where everyone else is suddenly holding their breath. Maeve was just trying to clear the damn glasses. She wasn't supposed to understand his language. She certainly wasn't supposed to snap back. But chronic exhaustion makes you stupid, and stupid gets you noticed by men who ruin lives for a living. Rain lashed against the frosted glass of the VIP lounge, turning the neon streetlights of the city into blurred, bleeding streaks of crimson and bruised purple. Maeve's left heel was currently home to a blister the size of a dime, rubbing raw against the stiff leather of her mandatory black pumps with every step she took. She shifted the serving tray, letting the smooth, varnished wood dig into her hip bone to take some of the weight off her wrists. 4 double scotches, neat, 2 crystal decanters of ice water, a plate of cured meats that cost more than her weekly rent. "Table 7, Maeve." Richard grunted as he breezed past her in the narrow service hallway. He smelled of cheap peppermint gum and nervous sweat. "Don't look at them. Don't linger. Drop the drinks. Wipe the condensation. Get out." She didn't nod. She just pushed through the heavy oak door that separated the chaotic, clattering kitchen from the hushed, velvet-lined sanctuary of the private rooms. The air shift was immediate. The humidity of dishwashers and frying oil vanished, replaced by the aggressively dry, climate-controlled chill of extreme wealth. The scent of aged cedarwood paneling mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and high-end cigar smoke. Table 7 was tucked in the far corner, flanked by 2 men who looked less like bodyguards and more like load-bearing walls wrapped in Italian wool. They didn't move as she approached, but their eyes tracked her collarbones, her hands, her tray, scanning for a threat in a woman wearing a polyester vest and an apron stained with grenadine. In the center of the semicircular booth sat Gabriel. She didn't know his last name, but everyone in the back of the house knew the first. He didn't come in often, maybe once a quarter, but when he did, the air in the restaurant turned brittle. He wasn't a loud, boisterous caricature of organized crime. He didn't wear flashy rings or pound his fists on the table. He was unnervingly still. As she stepped up to the edge of the table, she kept her eyes fixed on the mahogany surface. Gabriel was leaning back against the dark, red leather, a phone pressed flat against his ear. His free hand rested on the table, long fingers idly tracing the rim of an empty low-ball glass. She noticed the knuckles. Pale, slightly scarred, the skin pulled tight over bone. "I told Arthur the container stays at the docks until the union rep gets his envelope," Gabriel said into the phone. His voice was low, a dark, gravelly baritone that vibrated underneath the soft jazz playing from the hidden speakers. No accent in his English, just a flat, deadpan delivery that sounded bored with the violence it implied. "If he opens it early, break his fingers, all of them. Then call me back." He tossed the phone onto the table. It landed with a dull thud next to an ashtray. Maeve swallowed the dry lump in her throat and stepped forward, mechanically sliding the first glass of Macallan onto the embossed leather coaster. Her fingers were trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the fact that she had been on her feet for 11 hours and her blood sugar was crashing so hard her vision was getting fuzzy at the edges. "We have a leak in the South Ward," one of the men across from Gabriel muttered. "Let's call him the lieutenant." He had a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow and wore a tie that looked too tight for his thick neck. "Somebody's been talking to the feds about the warehouse." Gabriel didn't look at him. He was staring at his phone, his jaw muscles flexing rhythmically. He reached out and grabbed the glass she had just set down, lifting it before she could even place the water next to it. She moved to the next man, balancing the tray with her left hand while reaching across with her right. The muscles in her shoulder screamed in protest. "Just focus on the glasses," she told herself. "Set them down. Don't spill. Don't make a sound. Go to the back alley, smoke half a cigarette, and pretend your life hasn't completely stalled at 26. Then it happened. As she reached across to set down the lieutenant's drink, the heavy crystal decanter of water shifted on her tray. The condensation on the bottom had made the varnished wood slick. She felt the awful, slow motion slide. She twisted her wrist sharply to catch it, overcompensating. The decanter stayed upright, but a single, solid cube of ice sloshed over the rim, falling through the air and landing squarely on Gabriel's phone. It hit the glass screen with a sharp clack. The entire table froze. The lieutenant stopped talking mid-sentence. The two bodyguards shifted their weight, leather shoes creaking loudly against the hardwood floor. Maeve froze, her hand hovering mid-air, the tray burning into her palm. She stared at the cube of ice resting on the black screen of the phone, a small puddle of water already beginning to pool around the camera lens. The silence in the booth was absolute. It felt heavy, suffocating, like the pressure drop right before a thunderstorm. She didn't reach for the ice. Her brain misfired, rapidly cycling through the protocol of apology, but her throat was entirely sealed shut. Gabriel looked at the phone. Then, very slowly, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were the dull, flat grey of wet concrete. There was no immediate flash of anger in them, just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion mixed with a quiet disgust. He looked at her, the way you look at a cockroach that has inconveniently scurried across your shoe, something too pathetic to even be enraged by, just an annoyance that needed to be scraped away. She finally found a breath. "Sir, I am so sorry. Let me just—" She reached for the cloth tucked into her apron strings. Gabriel held up a single finger. The motion was so minimal, so casual, but it stopped her dead. She pulled her hand back, clutching the edge of her serving tray until her knuckles turned a bruised white. He didn't speak to her. He didn't even keep looking at her. He shifted his gaze back to his lieutenant, leaned his head against the red leather booth, and sighed heavily. The air left his nose in a slow, sharp hiss. Then he spoke. Not in English. "Shuf hal-kalba." The words hit the air like a physical blow, though only she seemed to feel the impact. Her stomach plummeted, a cold lead weight dropping straight through her pelvis. The ambient noise of the lounge, the clinking glasses, the muted brass of the jazz track, suddenly sounded miles away. He was speaking Levantine Arabic. "Kaifa Gabbia," Gabriel continued, his tone conversational, laced with a weary contempt. He picked up his glass of scotch, staring into the amber liquid. "Yirhamay amlama kenanet amalma rajal, yigibula hathi el zayabla teshof shogli." Look at this bitch, scared and stupid. God have mercy on the days when we dealt with men. They bring me this garbage to witness my business. The lieutenant let out a low, rough chuckle, picking up his own glass. He clearly understood enough of the dialect to catch the insult. He smirked at her, a lazy, predatory curling of his lips. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. A hot, prickly sweat broke out along her hairline. She wasn't supposed to know what he said. To them, she was just a ghost in a cheap uniform. A nameless, faceless American girl slinging overpriced liquor in a city that chewed people up for breakfast. They assumed the limits of her world were the swinging doors of the kitchen and the bus stop on 4th Street. They didn't know about the 3 years she spent in Amman. They didn't know about the dusty, suffocating translation booths where she tried to broker dialogue for a crumbling NGO. They didn't know how she had choked on the guttural K sounds until her throat bled, how she had learned to read the rolling cursive script off the sides of mortar-shelled buildings. She had left that life behind because she couldn't handle the futility of it, fleeing back to the States only to find out her degree was worthless and her trauma was unmarketable. Now here she was, the garbage, the scared, stupid dog. Gabriel finally reached out, pinched the ice cube between his thumb and forefinger, and dropped it into the ashtray. He didn't bother wiping the water off his phone. He just waved his hand dismissively in her direction, a gesture one might use to shoo away a fly. "Get out of here!" The lieutenant grunted at her in English, his voice harsh. "Send Richard back with some napkins, and tell him if he sends another clumsy idiot over here, we're finding a new place to drink." She should have nodded. She should have lowered her eyes, mumbled a pathetic apology, and scurried back to the kitchen. That was survival. That was the smart play. Richard would yell at her, dock her tips, maybe put her on the day shift for a week. But she would breathe. She would go home, soak her blistered feet in Epsom salts, and wake up tomorrow to do it all again. But as she stood there, looking at Gabriel's sharp, indifferent profile, something inside her simply snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break. It was quiet. It felt like a worn-out rubber band finally giving way. She was so tired. She was so unbelievably, deeply tired of being small. She was tired of apologizing for taking up space, tired of rich men sitting in dark rooms, acting like they owned the oxygen she was breathing. She placed her empty serving tray against her hip. She stood up straight, feeling the awful, grinding pop in her lower back as she adjusted her posture. She didn't step back. She didn't retreat. Instead, she reached into her apron, pulled out the folded white linen napkin, and tossed it onto the table. It landed softly, right over the puddle of water on Gabriel's phone. The lieutenant stiffened. The two bodyguards instantly shifted their hands toward their suit jackets, the fabric pulling taut over hidden holsters. The rustle of expensive wool was deafeningly loud. Gabriel stopped moving. His thumb hovered over the rim of his glass. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head to look at her again. The flat, deadpan boredom in his grey eyes was gone, replaced by a sudden, razor-sharp focus. Her mouth was so dry it felt like she was chewing on sand. Her hands were shaking, but she forced her voice to stay level. She locked her eyes directly onto his, refusing to let them dart away. "Al-Jaban bas beyistakba wara lugatanya," she said. Her accent wasn't perfect. It had been nearly 2 years since she'd spoken the language out loud, and the words scratched against the back of her throat. But the pronunciation was clear. Guttural. Authentic. Gabriel's eyes widened, just a fraction of a millimeter. It was a micro-expression, a tiny tightening of the muscles around his jaw, but in a man made of stone, it was a seismic reaction. She took a slow breath, letting the adrenaline flood her veins, burning away the exhaustion in her legs. "Ashan yishtim wahda btechtimo," she continued, keeping her volume low, matching his previous conversational tone. "Hadamabidul alakwatak, hadabidul enak jaban." Only a coward hides behind another language to insult someone serving him. That doesn't show your power. It shows you are a coward. The silence that followed was entirely different from the one before. This wasn't the heavy pressure of a storm. This was the vacuum of a bomb just before the shockwave hits. The lieutenant's face drained of color. He looked from her to Gabriel, his mouth opening slightly in shock. He understood what she had said. Gabriel stared at her. He didn't blink. The air between them felt thick, electric, humming with a sudden violent tension. She could see the subtle pulse beating rapidly in the hollow of his neck, just above the collar of his custom shirt. She could smell the sharp, metallic scent of his cologne, suddenly overwhelming in her nostrils. Her mind was screaming at her. Run! Walk away! Apologize! Beg! The instinct for self-preservation was battering against her ribcage, frantic and desperate. She had just called a Mafia boss a coward to his face, in his own private language, in a room full of his armed men. She was going to end up in the trunk of a Lincoln before her shift officially ended, but her feet were rooted to the floorboards. She met his stare with a hollow, dead-eyed exhaustion of her own. If he was going to kill her, he was going to have to do it while looking at her. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The lieutenant moved first. He cursed under his breath and started to slide out of the booth, his hand diving decisively into his jacket. "You little—" Gabriel raised his hand. He didn't look at the lieutenant. He didn't turn his head. He just lifted his palm in the air, and the other man froze instantly, sinking back into the leather seat with a look of pure, constrained fury. Gabriel slowly lowered his hand. He placed it flat on the table, right next to the napkin she had thrown. He tilted his head slightly, studying her face as if he were seeing her for the very first time. His eyes scanned the dark circles under her eyes, the cheap, frayed collar of her shirt, the tight, white-knuckled grip she had on her serving tray. He wasn't angry. That was the most terrifying part. He looked intrigued. The dead grey concrete of his eyes had shifted, catching the dim light of the lounge and turning into polished steel. He leaned forward, bridging the physical gap between them. She forced herself not to flinch as his face came within inches of her chest. "Your accent is Levantine," he said in English. His voice was a quiet, vibrating rasp that made the hair on her arms stand up. "But your grammar is purely textbook. Who taught you?" She swallowed hard. Life. A tiny, sharp exhalation of breath escaped his nose. It might have been a laugh, but the sound held absolutely no humor. Life. He echoed, testing the word on his tongue. He reached out and picked up the damp napkin, slowly wiping the water from the screen of his phone. He folded the linen neatly into a perfect square and set it down. "Life teaches us many things, Waitress. Mostly it teaches us when to keep our mouths shut." "Then I guess I was a bad student," she replied, her voice cracking slightly on the last syllable. Gabriel's eyes flicked to her mouth, watching her lips tremble, before rising back to lock onto her gaze. "We will see," he murmured softly. He picked up his glass of scotch and raised it a few inches in the air, a mocking toast. He took a slow, deliberate sip, never breaking eye contact. She didn't wait for him to dismiss her a second time. Her legs felt like they were made of wet sand, but she forced them to move. She turned around, presenting her back to a table of killers, and walked toward the kitchen doors. Every step felt like walking through deep water. She waited for the shout. She waited for the heavy hand to clamp down on her shoulder, for the cold press of metal against her spine. Nothing happened. She pushed through the oak doors, the noise and heat of the kitchen slamming back into her. The moment the door swung shut behind her, the adrenaline evaporated completely. Her knees buckled. She slammed her hand against the stainless steel prep counter to catch herself, the serving tray clattering loudly to the floor. "Jesus, Maeve!" Richard barked from across the room, brandishing a pair of tongs. "Watch the equipment. You drop off table 7? She leaned heavily over the counter, gasping for air, feeling the cold sweat trickling down her spine. The smell of frying oil made her want to vomit. "Yeah," she choked out, squeezing her eyes shut. "Table 7 is done." But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. Because as she stood there, shaking in the greasy heat of the kitchen, she could still feel the phantom weight of his flat, grey eyes burning a hole right between her shoulder blades. She had demanded to be seen. And God help her, he was looking. Industrial bleach and stale beer. That was the perfume of the graveyard shift. Her hands were submerged in a stainless steel sink, full of scalding soapy water, aggressively scrubbing the lipstick off a highball glass. The friction of the sponge against the rim was a harsh, repetitive squeak that dug right into the base of her skull. It was 3:15 a.m. The lounge had finally bled out its last patrons, leaving behind nothing but crushed napkins, rings of condensation on the mahogany tables, and the sour scent of fermented grain. Her heart hadn't stopped its frantic, uneven rhythm since she walked out of the VIP room. She kept expecting the kitchen doors to swing open. She kept bracing for Richard's shrill voice demanding she pack up her locker. Or worse. She kept listening for the heavy, synchronized footsteps of men who didn't bother knocking. Neither came. Instead, she finished the glasses. She hauled the rubber floor mats out to the back alley and sprayed them down with a power hose that leaked freezing water all over her sneakers. The November wind whipped through the narrow corridor between the brick buildings, carrying the smells of wet dumpsters and exhaust fumes. She shivered violently, a polyester uniform providing zero insulation. "You're done, Maeve." Richard grunted, leaning out the back door. He didn't look at her. He was busy counting a stack of receipts. "Close the gate on your way out." He didn't fire her. He didn't even mention Table 7. She nodded numbly, wrapping her cheap acrylic scarf around her neck. She grabbed her canvas tote bag from the break room and pushed through the heavy metal fire door out into the alley. The city at this hour was a hollowed-out concrete shell. The rain had stopped, but the streets were slick and black, reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the street lamps. She walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, her wet sneakers squeaking rhythmically against the pavement. The blister on her heel had popped an hour ago. Now it was just a dull, rhythmic burn. The bus shelter smelled of old urine and wet cardboard. She sat down on the cold plastic bench, pulling her knees up to her chest to conserve body heat. What had she done? The adrenaline was completely gone, leaving behind a nauseating void. Her hands began to shake again, not from cold, but from a delayed, crushing wave of terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her palms against her forehead. She had looked a cartel operator, a mafia boss, whatever the hell Gabriel actually was, dead in his flat grey eyes, and called him a coward. She remembered the absolute stillness of his posture, the way his hand had flattened next to the napkin. He hadn't been enraged. He had been curious. That was infinitely worse. Anger is an emotion. It burns hot and it eventually burns out. Curiosity is a parasite. It digs in. A pair of headlights swept across the wet asphalt, breaking her spiral. She looked up, squinting through the glare. It wasn't the city bus. It was a heavy, dark sedan, a Lincoln or a Mercedes, she couldn't tell in the dark. It rolled past the bus stop with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The windows were tinted pitch black, absorbing the yellow streetlights without reflecting them. It didn't stop. It just coasted past, the tires making a wet, tearing sound against the puddles, before it turned the corner and disappeared. She stopped breathing until the tail lights vanished. It was just a car, just a late-night driver. That's what she told herself as the rattling, oversized frame of the 4th Street bus finally crested the hill. She paid her fare, walked to the very back, and sat in the corner seat over the rear axle. The heater beneath the window was broken, blowing tepid, dusty air against her shins. She leaned her head against the vibrating safety glass and watched the decaying storefronts blur past. Her apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up, in a neighborhood where the police sirens were basically white noise. She climbed the stairs, the muscles in her thighs trembling with fatigue. She unlocked the deadbolt, the chain, and the handle lock, pushing the warped wooden door open. The studio was freezing. The radiator clanked uselessly in the corner, a hollow metallic rhythm. She didn't turn on the lights. She dropped her bag on the linoleum kitchen floor, walked straight to the tiny, rust-stained bathroom, and stripped off the uniform. It smelled like cigarette smoke and fried food. She shoved it into a plastic trash bag and tied it shut. She stood in the shower until the water turned from lukewarm to ice cold, scrubbing her skin with a bar of cheap soap until it was raw. She wanted to wash the entire night off her. She wanted to wash Ammon off her. She wanted to scrub away the Arabic words that had betrayed her, the language that she had buried under a mountain of mundane, minimum-wage exhaustion. She crawled into bed, pulling the thin quilt up to her chin. She lay in the dark, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. She listened to the wind rattling the loose window pane. She survived. She was home. Tomorrow was Wednesday. She had a double shift. Life would go on. But as she finally drifted into a fractured, shallow sleep, all she saw were those flat, deadpan grey eyes, watching her from the dark. She woke up with a headache that felt like a rusty nail driven right between her temples. The harsh, anemic light of late morning filtered through the broken blinds of her window. Her phone screen glared at her from the nightstand. 11:45 a.m. She had exactly 45 minutes to swallow a fistful of ibuprofen, drink something resembling coffee, and get to her day job at the diner across town. Her bones ached with a deep, marrow-level fatigue. The memory of the VIP lounge felt distant, muffled by the immediate, pressing reality of poverty. She had rent due in 4 days. She didn't have the luxury of existential dread. She threw on a pair of faded jeans and a heavy grey sweater that had started unraveling at the cuffs. She tied her damp hair into a messy knot at the base of her neck. The diner was a grease-coated relic on the edge of the industrial district, a place where long-haul truckers and local mechanics drank black coffee out of chipped ceramic mugs. The air inside was thick with the smell of scorched bacon grease, maple syrup, and old leather. It was a chaotic, loud, fluorescently lit nightmare, and she usually loved it for exactly that reason. It was impossible to think in here. Table 4 needs a wipe-down, Maeve, and the guy in the corner booth has been waiting on a refill for 10 minutes. Sarah yelled over the hiss of the flat-top grill as she tied a stained apron around her waist. "On it!" she rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. She grabbed a damp rag and a fresh pot of decaf, weaving through the crowded, narrow aisles. The lunchtime rush was loud. Clattering silverware, overlapping conversations, the sharp bell from the kitchen line. It was normal. It was perfectly, wonderfully mundane. Until she turned the corner toward the back booths. The man sitting in the red vinyl booth wasn't wearing mechanic's coveralls or a delivery uniform. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than the diner's annual revenue. A charcoal grey overcoat was draped neatly over the back of the seat. He had a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. The coffee pot in her hand suddenly felt like a 10-pound weight. Her feet stopped moving. The ambient noise of the diner, the chewing, the laughing, the clatter of plates, seemed to dial down to a muted hum, leaving a ringing sound in her ears. It was the lieutenant. The man who had laughed at Gabriel's insult. The man who had reached for his gun. He wasn't looking at a menu. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking directly at her, his hands folded patiently on the Formica table. Her stomach plummeted, a cold, heavy stone dropping into her pelvis. She looked around frantically. Sarah was arguing with the cook. 2 regulars were arguing about sports at the counter. Nobody noticed the predator sitting in the corner. Nobody noticed that the oxygen had just been sucked out of the room. She couldn't run. Her apron was tied tightly around her waist, pulling her down to this floor. Her bag was in the back room. She took a shallow, shaking breath, gripped the handle of the coffee pot until her knuckles ached, and forced herself to walk forward. "Show no fear," the survival instinct whispered. "They smell it like blood." She stopped at his table. She didn't say a word. She just lifted the pot and poured a stream of black coffee into the heavy white mug resting in front of him. Her hand trembled slightly, a few drops splashing onto the table. The lieutenant watched the dark liquid spill over the rim. He didn't flinch. "Sloppy," he murmured. His voice was rough, like a rusted hinge. He spoke in English, devoid of the lazy amusement from the night before. She set the pot down with a dull clunk. "What do you want?" She kept her voice flat, low. She didn't look at his hands, though she knew exactly what was hidden under the lapel of that expensive jacket. He didn't answer immediately. He reached into his breast pocket. Her breath hitched in her throat, her muscles locking up, preparing for a sudden, loud violence. Instead, he pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He placed it squarely over the spilled coffee drops on the table. The heavy paper absorbed the dark liquid instantly, staining the crisp edges. "Mr. Rossi doesn't like loose ends," the lieutenant said softly. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. He smelled strongly of peppermint and cordite. He also doesn't like coincidence. A waitress who understands Levantine Arabic drops a glass on his phone the same night we're discussing port security. You can see how that looks. "It looks like an accident." She shot back, her voice tighter, thinner than she wanted it to be. "I dropped an ice cube, that's it." The lieutenant smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You called him a coward, sweetheart. Accident or not, you made yourself visible. That was your mistake." He tapped a thick finger against the envelope. "Inside is compensation for your remaining shifts this week. You're taking the next 3 days off from both of your jobs. Your boss here has already been informed you had a family emergency. The lounge knows you're sick." Panic flared hot in her chest. "You can't do that. I need these shifts. I can't just—" "You can and you will!" He cut her off, his tone entirely devoid of aggression, which somehow made it terrifyingly absolute. "There is an address on the back of that envelope. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., a car will be waiting outside your building to take you there. Mr. Rossi has questions for you. You will answer them." She stared at the thick envelope. The cream paper felt like a death warrant resting on a sticky diner table. "And if I don't get in the car?" she whispered, her throat burning. The lieutenant picked up the mug of scalding hot coffee. He didn't blow on it. He took a slow, deliberate sip. "We know you live on the 4th floor, Maeve. We know your lock is broken. We know you worked for an NGO in Amman between 2021 and 2024. We know you left suddenly. We know you have no immediate family within 500 miles. He set the mug down gently. "If you don't get in the car, I will come upstairs and fetch you. I promise you, I will not be polite about it." He didn't wait for her to process it. He stood up, picked up his overcoat, and walked past her toward the exit. The bell above the diner door jingled cheerfully as he stepped out into the grey afternoon. She stood frozen, staring at the empty vinyl booth. A drop of spilled coffee ran off the edge of the table and splattered onto the toe of her sneaker. She reached out and picked up the envelope. It was heavy. It felt like holding a brick. She turned it over. In precise, black, fountain pen ink, an address was written across the back. It wasn't a warehouse. It wasn't the docks. It was an address in the financial district. The Blacktown car, idling at the curb of her street the next morning, looked violently out of place against the backdrop of overflowing trash cans and graffitied brick. The engine was running, a low, barely perceptible purr that vibrated through the cracked sidewalk. It was exactly 9 a.m. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night staring at the envelope, which contained more cash than she made in 3 months, bound in a single, terrifyingly neat stack of hundreds. She hadn't touched it. She had packed a small duffel bag at 2 a.m., entertaining the delusion of running, before realizing the lieutenant had made his point clearly. Running only turned this into a hunt. She was utterly, painfully trapped by the logistics of poverty. She walked out of her building wearing her best pair of slacks and a black turtleneck, trying to project an armor she didn't possess. The cold morning air bit at her cheeks. As she approached the car, the rear door swung open. A man in a dark suit, not the lieutenant, someone younger with a flat, broken nose, nodded curtly. He didn't speak. She slid into the back seat. The door closed with a heavy, vacuum-sealed thud, cutting off the noise of the city completely. The interior smelled of expensive leather and ozone. She sank into the seat, gripping her hands together in her lap to stop them from shaking. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, gliding through the decaying neighborhood like a shark through murky water. They drove in total silence for 20 minutes. She watched the scenery change through the tinted glass. The bodegas and chain-link fences gradually gave way to towering glass facades, polished marble plazas, and men carrying briefcases. The financial district, the heart of the city's legitimate blood flow. The car descended into an underground parking garage, spiraling down 3 levels before stopping in a private, brightly lit VIP section. Elevator. Penthouse, the driver said, his first and only words. She got out. The air in the garage was dry and smelled of hot tires. She walked to the private elevator bay, pressing the only button available. The steel doors slid open instantly. There were no buttons inside, just a biometric scanner that apparently recognized the weight of the car's arrival, because the doors closed and her stomach dropped as the car shot upward. She expected a dungeon. She expected a dark, smoke-filled room in a basement. The elevator doors chimed and slid open, revealing an expanse of blinding clinical sunlight. She stepped out into an open-concept office that occupied the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the harbor and the grey, choppy water of the bay. The floors were polished concrete. The furniture was minimalist, sharp angles of black steel and white oak. It looked like the headquarters of a tech startup, not a Mafia stronghold. At the far end of the room, sitting behind a massive slab of a desk, was Gabriel Rossi. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the pale skin and a faint network of faded, jagged scars running up his left wrist. He was wearing silver-rimmed reading glasses, staring intently at a glowing tablet. He didn't look up when the elevator doors opened. The utter banality of the scene was somehow more terrifying than if he had been holding a gun. He was just doing paperwork. She stood by the elevator, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She refused to walk toward him. If he wanted to speak to her, he could acknowledge she was in the room. 2 minutes passed. The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the soft, rhythmic tapping of his stylus against the tablet screen. Finally, he set the stylus down. He took off his reading glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and let out a long, quiet sigh. Then he looked at her. In the harsh daylight, his eyes weren't the flat grey of wet concrete. They were lighter, almost the color of fractured ice. They held that same intense, dissecting curiosity from the lounge. "You didn't touch the money," he said. His voice carried across the empty room, a low, gravelly baritone that required no volume to be imposing. She swallowed hard, her throat sandpaper dry. "I don't accept severance pay from jobs I haven't quit. You quit the moment you opened your mouth on Monday night," Gabriel replied evenly. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Come here." It wasn't a request. She forced her legs to move, crossing the vast expanse of polished concrete. Her sensible shoes clicked loudly, completely destroying any illusion of a silent, dignified approach. She stopped a good 10 feet from the edge of his desk. Gabriel watched her the entire time. his gaze cataloguing the defensive crossing of her arms, the rigid set of her jaw, the dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. "Maeve," he said, tasting her name. He said it slowly, drawing out the vowel. 26. A degree in linguistics that you haven't used in 2 years. You work 50 hours a week between a diner that violates 3 health codes and a lounge that overcharges for watered-down liquor. If you brought me here to critique my resume, you could have just sent an email. She snapped. The words were out of her mouth before her brain could stop them. Her heart stalled. She braced herself for the anger, for the lieutenant to appear from a hidden door and break her jaw. Gabriel didn't move. A slow, terrifyingly subtle smirk touched the corner of his mouth. It was a dark, hollow expression. "Defiance," he murmured. "It's a strange defense mechanism for someone who is clearly terrified. Your heart is beating so hard I can see the pulse in your neck from here." She reached up defensively, pressing her hand against her throat. She hated him for noticing. She hated him for being right. "I'm here," she said, forcing her voice to stabilize. "Your guy threatened me. I'm here. What do you want?" Gabriel unsteepled his fingers and rested his hands flat on the desk. "Monday night. You reacted. People who work in service do not react to me. They vanish into the wallpaper. You not only understood a dialect native to a very specific, very violent part of the world, but you possessed the idiocy to use it to insult me." He stood up. He was taller than she realized, broad-shouldered and possessing a dense, coiled energy. He walked slowly around the edge of the desk, leaning against the front of it, crossing his ankles. The proximity made the air in the room feel instantly 10 degrees colder. "My associates believe you are a plant," he continued casually. "A listening post for the feds, or perhaps a spy for the Moretti family. They think your little outburst was a calculated slip, a way to build a bridge. I drop off drinks, Mr. Rossi," she said flatly, looking him dead in the eyes. "I don't build bridges. I dropped an ice cube." Gabriel tilted his head. "So you claim. But then there is the matter of Aman. 3 years brokering translations for a refugee NGO. And then, abruptly, you return to the States and completely abandon your field, choosing to scrub toilets and pour coffee instead." He took a single step toward her. "I don't believe in accidents, Maeve, and I don't believe in wasted talent. Tell me why a woman who speaks perfect Levantine Arabic is hiding in a slum diner." "I'm not hiding," she lied. "You are," he stated, stepping closer. She could smell the ozone and cedarwood on him now. "You are terrified. You are vibrating with it. But Monday night, when I spoke, the anger momentarily overpowered the fear." "Why?" She stared at his pale, scarred knuckles resting on his slacks. She thought about the dust, the blood, the absolute, soul-crushing futility of translating the grief of mothers who had lost everything to men who didn't care. She thought about the wealthy men in suits who orchestrated the violence from air-conditioned rooms, while the people she lived with bled out in the streets. She looked up, meeting his fractured ice eyes, letting a fraction of that old, bitter rot seep into her own. "Because I spent 3 years watching men exactly like you destroy lives in a language I had to learn how to speak," she whispered, the words tearing raw against her throat. "And I promised myself I would never let one of you talk down to me in it again." Gabriel went perfectly still. The smirk vanished from his lips. The clinical detachment in his eyes shattered, replaced by a sudden, heavy darkness that felt like gravity pulling her under. Gabriel didn't blink. The silence stretched between them, thin and fragile as spun glass. She had just laid her darkest, most pathetic truth at the feet of a man who dealt in extortion and blood, fully expecting him to mock it. Or worse, to pity her, He did neither. Instead, he took a step back, breaking the suffocating proximity. The heavy darkness in his eyes didn't recede, but it shifted, solidifying into something cold and calculating. He reached up, slowly undoing the top button of his crisp white shirt, his eyes never leaving her face. 3 years, he repeated, his voice dropping an octave. You sat in the dust and translated the grief of collateral damage. You watched men burn the world down, and you decided your penance was to come back here, serve cheap scotch, and disappear into the working poor. It's called making a living. She shot back, though her voice lacked its previous venom. Her legs were beginning to tremble. It's called financial suicide, born of survivor's guilt. Gabriel corrected effortlessly. He walked behind his massive desk and sat down, leaning back into the leather. The physical distance allowed her to draw a full breath for the first time in 5 minutes. And it is a profound waste of a specialized skill set, a skill set I currently require. Her heart gave a painful, irregular thud. I don't work for criminals. You worked at a diner that launders money for the local bookies, Maeve. You serve drinks at a lounge owned by a shell corporation tied to my lieutenant. You already work for criminals. The only difference is the pay scale. He opened a silver case on his desk, extracting a heavy, unlit cigar. He didn't light it. He just rolled it between his scarred fingers. On Friday, I have a delegation arriving from Beirut. They are moving product through the eastern ports. My usual translator caught a sudden violent case of lead poisoning last week. I need someone in the room who understands the dialect, the cultural nuances, and the subtext. Hire a professional, she said, her palms sweating. Professionals ask questions. Professionals have ethics that can be compromised or leveraged by the feds. Gabriel stated, his gaze pinning her to the floorboards. You are broke. You have no family. You have a profound, self-righteous hatred for men like me, which means you won't fall for their charm, and you won't try to play a secondary angle. You are perfect. I said no. $10,000, he said. The number hung in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the penthouse. Her breath hitched. 10,000. That was her rent for the year. That was groceries. That was a new mattress that didn't drive springs into her ribs. It was freedom from the crushing, daily panic of checking her bank account. Gabriel watched the math happen in her head. He watched her principles violently collide with her poverty. He didn't smile, but she could feel his triumph. 1 meeting, he continued softly, reeling the line in. 3 hours of your time. You sit in a chair, you tell me exactly what they say when they think I'm not listening, and then you walk away. I will even have my driver drop you back at your miserable 4th-floor walk-up. You never have to see me again. And if I still refuse? Gabriel placed the cigar down on the desk. He leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. The predatory stillness returned. I am offering you a choice because I appreciate your anger, Maeve. It's rare that someone looks at me with genuine disgust instead of fear. But do not mistake my appreciation for patience. His voice was a flat, dead calm. You are already in my world. You stepped into it the moment you threw that napkin. You can walk out of this building today. But you will lose the diner. You will lose the lounge. Your landlord will find a reason to evict you by Tuesday. I will not lay a finger on you, but I will make this city uninhabitable for you. It wasn't a threat. It was a weather report. Absolute, unavoidable, and entirely out of her control. She hated him in that moment with a purity that tasted like copper in the back of her throat. She hated the expensive cut of his clothes, the effortless power he wielded from an ergonomic desk chair. But most of all, she hated that a tiny, sick part of her brain was relieved. The decision was made for her. She didn't have to be brave anymore. She looked down at her scuffed, sensible shoes. Friday. Friday. Gabriel confirmed. My tailor will send a selection of clothes to your apartment tomorrow. I will not have my translator looking like she crawled out of a Goodwill dumpster. You will wear what they send. The car will pick you up at 8. He picked up his stylus and tapped the tablet screen, returning to his paperwork. The audience was over. She stood there for a long moment, her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to scream. She wanted to flip his desk. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked back toward the elevator. The doors slid open silently. As she stepped inside, she looked back. Gabriel wasn't looking at his tablet. He was watching her. The fractured ice of his eyes tracked her until the steel doors slid shut, sealing her inside her new reality. Structured wool and dry-cleaned silk. That's what complicity feels like against the skin. The dress Gabriel's people had sent was a charcoal, long-sleeved sheath dress. It fit with a terrifying precision. Armor tailored to her exact measurements. It came with a pair of black leather pumps that didn't pinch her heels and a discreet, matte black earpiece. Looking in the cracked mirror of her bathroom, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The exhaustion was still there, painting bruised shadows under her eyes. But the cheapness was gone. She looked sharp. She looked dangerous. The meeting wasn't at the penthouse. The town car dropped her at an unmarked, windowless warehouse in the meatpacking district. The air smelled of salt, rusted iron, and old blood. Gabriel was already there, standing near a rusted conveyor belt, flanked by the lieutenant and 4 other men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast. Gabriel wore a black overcoat over a dark suit, his hands in his pockets. When he saw her approach, his eyes did a slow, clinical sweep of her body. "You look the part," he murmured as she stopped next to him. "I feel like a hostage in a very expensive costume," she replied, staring straight ahead at the heavy corrugated metal doors at the far end of the room. Gabriel let out a brief, dark exhale that might have been a laugh. "Hostages don't get paid. Put the earpiece in. When they speak, you will translate it directly into my ear. Do not summarize. Do not filter. If they insult my mother, I want the exact phrasing. Understood." She pressed the small device into her left ear. 10 minutes later, the corrugated doors groaned open. 3 black SUVs rolled into the warehouse, their tires crunching over the concrete. The doors opened in unison, and the Levantine delegation stepped out. The leader was an older man with a thick, graying beard and eyes like polished obsidian. Let's call him Tariq. He wore a Western suit, but he carried himself with the heavy, deliberate arrogance of a warlord. She felt a sudden, sickening flash of muscle memory. The smell of dust, the rattle of gunfire, the heavy heat of Amman. She dug her perfectly manicured nails into her palms until the pain grounded her. Gabriel stepped forward. "Tariq, welcome to my city." "Gabriel," Tariq replied in heavily accented English, extending a hand. The handshake was brief, a collision of 2 predators testing the tension in the room. They moved to a makeshift table, a wooden crate covered by a tarp, and the negotiations began. For the first 20 minutes, they spoke in English. They discussed shipping containers, union bribes, and port security. It was incredibly boring, bureaucratic evil. Then, Tariq leaned back, steepling his fingers. He switched to Arabic, looking at his second-in-command. "The Italian is desperate," Tariq murmured softly, the guttural consonants rolling smoothly off his tongue. He lost his foothold in the south. Push for the 70-30 split. If he refuses, we hold the weapons in Cyprus until he bleeds out. Her heart kicked into a frantic rhythm. She tapped the hidden mic on her collar and whispered into it, her voice barely a breath. "He thinks you're desperate. He knows about the South Ward. He wants a 70-30 split. or he's going to hold the shipment in Cyprus." Gabriel didn't react. Not a muscle in his face twitched. He kept his eyes locked on Tariq, a mask of total deadpan boredom. "I am offering 60-40. Gabriel said in English, his voice smooth and flat. "That is more than generous given the current heat at the ports. If you hold out for 70, I will find another supplier." Tariq smiled, a cold, empty expression. He turned back to his man, speaking Arabic again. "Call his bluff. He has no other supplier. And if he pushes back, tell the docks to strike. Let him choke on his own logistics." Tariq then turned to Gabriel, smiling warmly in English. "My friend, 60-40 is an insult to the risk we take." She translated the Arabic threat into Gabriel's ear. This time, she saw it. The microscopic tightening of Gabriel's jaw, the sudden, violent stillness of his hands. He was going to kill them. He wasn't going to negotiate. He was going to signal his lieutenant, and the warehouse was going to turn into a slaughterhouse. She knew the look. She had seen it on the faces of warlords right before a village burned. Tariq's second-in-command sneered, muttering something under his breath in a localized, slang-heavy dialect. "Shuf hal kalb el mayat, Mafia ru." Look at this dead dog. He has no soul. It was a severe insult, a challenge to his masculinity, to his authority. Gabriel waited for her translation. The silence stretched. The lieutenant shifted his weight, his hand drifting dangerously close to his jacket. The air in the warehouse turned brittle, oxygen turning to gasoline, waiting for a spark. If she told Gabriel what the man just said, people were going to die. She would be standing in the middle of a gunfight. The blood would be on her dress. The trauma she had run halfway across the world to escape would be right here, soaking into her expensive leather shoes. She pressed the button on her collar. "He said you are a hard bargainer." She whispered into the mic, her voice steady, betraying nothing. "He is complaining to Tariq that they are losing money, but they will accept 65. It was a lie, a massive, dangerous, calculated lie. Gabriel's eyes flicked to her for a fraction of a second. It was a terrifying gaze, piercing right through her skull. He knew she altered something. He could feel the lack of symmetry between the man's sneer and her sterile translation. But Gabriel Rossi was not a reckless man. He calculated the odds. He looked back at Tariq. 65, Gabriel said smoothly. "And the container arrives by Thursday. Do we have a deal?" Tariq looked at his second-in-command, surprised by the sudden compromise. The second-in-command frowned, confused, but nodded slowly. Tariq turned back to Gabriel. "Thursday." Tariq agreed. The tension evaporated. Hands were shaken. The Levantine delegation got back into their SUVs and rolled out of the warehouse, taking the suffocating threat of violence with them. She stood paralyzed by the wooden crate. Her legs felt like jelly. She had just lied to a mafia boss to stop a gang war. The adrenaline crash hit her so hard her vision blurred. "Clear the room," Gabriel commanded, not looking at his men. Within 30 seconds, the lieutenant and the guards were gone, retreating to the vehicles outside. The heavy metal doors clanged shut, plunging the warehouse into dim, dusty silence. She was alone with Gabriel. Gabriel walked toward her slowly. His footsteps echoed off the concrete, deliberate and heavy. He stopped inches from her, invading her physical space with a sudden, overwhelming heat. He smelled of cedarwood, gunpowder, and predatory intent. "Take the earpiece out," he ordered softly. Her hands were shaking so badly she fumbled the small plastic device, dropping it onto the floor. She didn't bend to pick it up. She kept her chin high, meeting his gaze. Gabriel reached out. She flinched, bracing for a strike, but his hand bypassed her face entirely. his large, scarred palm wrapped around the back of her neck, his fingers tangled in the hair at the base of her skull, his thumb resting dangerously close to her carotid artery. The touch was electric. It sent a violent, confusing shockwave of fear and sudden, agonizing heat straight down her spine. She gasped, her lips parting, her eyes going wide. "You lied to me," Gabriel whispered, leaning in so close his breath brushed her cheek. "You filtered the translation. You actively managed the negotiation. I stopped a bloodbath." She forced the words out, her voice trembling against the pressure of his grip. "He insulted you. If I translated it, you would have ordered your men to shoot. I saved your deal." Gabriel's thumb stroked the erratic pulse jumping in her neck. The gentleness of the gesture was horrifyingly at odds with the violence in his eyes. "You think you understand how my world works because you spent a few years watching street thugs in the desert," he murmured, his voice a dark, velvet rasp. "You think you saved me from my own temper. I don't have a temper, Maeve. I am a machine. If I wanted them dead, they would have been dead before they stepped out of the cars." He pulled her an inch closer. The front of her charcoal dress brushed against the wool of his overcoat. "What he said," Gabriel continued, his voice dropping to a near-silent vibration, "was an insult to my soul. I caught the word kalb, dog, and you swallowed it to protect the peace." "I did what I had to do," she breathed, unable to look away from his fractured ice eyes. "I refuse to be the reason men die." "You already are," he replied simply. "The moment you stepped into this warehouse, you became part of the machinery. You facilitated the movement of weapons that will inevitably end lives. You are not clean anymore, Maeve. You are covered in it." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. The moral high ground she had clung to, the self-righteous anger, it was gone. She had taken the $10,000. She had worn the dress. She had brokered the deal. She wasn't an innocent bystander. She was an accomplice. Tears of pure frustration pricked the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Gabriel watched the realization break over her. The harshness in his face softened just a fraction. He didn't release her neck. Instead, his other hand came up, resting flat against her lower back, pulling her flush against his chest. "You hate it," he murmured, staring down at her mouth. "You hate that you are here." "I despise you," she whispered, the words trembling. "I know," he replied, "but you hate the diner more. You hate being invisible more. For 3 years you have been a ghost. Today you held the lives of 10 men in your throat, and you made a choice. You felt the power of it." He was right. God, he was right. Beneath the terror, beneath the crushing guilt, there was a dark, intoxicating thrill. She had mattered. She had controlled the room. Gabriel tilted her head back slightly, exposing her throat to the dim light. "You are not a waitress, Maeve. You are a weapon that has been left to rust. I am simply sharpening you." He didn't kiss her. The tension between them was screaming for it, a thick, suffocating gravity pulling them together. But he didn't cross that line. He understood power too well. He knew that taking it wasn't nearly as effective as making him want her to. He slowly uncurled his fingers from her hair. He let his hand drop from her waist. The sudden absence of his heat left her shivering, breathless, and entirely unmoored. "The 10,000 will be in your account by morning," Gabriel said, stepping back, instantly rebuilding the impenetrable wall of the Mafia boss. "My driver will take you home." He turned and walked toward the corrugated doors, leaving her standing alone in the center of the warehouse. She looked down at her hands. They had stopped shaking. The terror was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy resignation. She touched the fabric of the expensive dress, feeling the sleek structure of it against her ribs. She thought about the mouldy walls of her apartment. She thought about the smell of bleach and old beer at the lounge. Gabriel Rossi hadn't just bought her silence today. He had infected her. He had shown her the dark, pulsing heart of his world, and then walked away, knowing exactly what he was leaving behind. She wasn't going back to the diner. They both knew it. Are you hooked on this dark, slow burn tension? If you felt your pulse race during Maeve and Gabriel's dangerous game of translation and control, you won't want to miss what happens next. The line between enemy and accomplice has been shattered, and Maeve is stepping entirely into the shadows. Drop a like if you love a raw, morally grey romance, share this video with your fellow dark romance readers, and hit that subscribe button to catch the final parts of Maeve and Gabriel's intoxicating story. Let me know in the comments, would you have translated the insult?